A person is known by the company he keeps. An old saying which goes back to Aesop, that writer of fables. And there's some truth to that saying, isn't there? Think of it from the parents' point of view. Parents worry about the type of friends that their children make. They hope that their friends will be a good influence, not a bad influence. Of course, nowadays, online friends become even more of an issue, don't they? Politicians get into trouble if they seem to be mixing with the wrong people. And then, of course, there's asylum seekers, criminals. They fled their own country where they're in awful danger. How dare they come as intruders into our land? They're not our kind of people, are they? We don't want to mix with them, do we? We've got to mix with the right people. Jesus got into trouble for the company he kept. As a preacher and teacher, he wasn't doing himself any favours by basing himself up north in Galilee. He should have spent more time training in Jerusalem, where the proper teachers and the experts were based. And then he could make sure that his teachings were correct and his message would be approved rather than disapproved of. But worse than that, Jesus had gathered around him a motley group of mainly Galileans, certainly not theological experts. These people had done no proper training, and Jesus then had taken it upon himself, without proper training, to teach them himself. But even worse than that was the ordinary people that Jesus was spending time with. He seemed to actually enjoy mixing with the wrong kind of people, spiritual outsiders, people regarded as particularly sinful, people who would seldom be seen at the synagogue where decent, moral, religious people go. Even prostitutes seemed to be welcomed by him, and even those terrible tax collectors who lined their own pockets as they collected for the Roman occupying forces. Mixing with the wrong people, well and truly. How could a man who claimed to be a spiritual teacher associate with those kinds of people, even to the point of seeming to enjoy their company? Well, the question was often asked, and when questioned about this eccentricity, Jesus referred to people who are unwell and need a doctor. He explained that he was seeking to fulfill the needs of those who need spiritual healing. And then in Luke 15, we actually find 3 familiar stories that Jesus told in response to this accusation. We know them: the sheep that got lost, and after a great search it was found again. It might have only been 1 out of 100 sheep, but there was still a great celebration when the sheep was found. And then there's the coin that was lost, and after a great search it was found again. It was only one out of 10 coins, but there was a great celebration when that lost coin was found. And then, as we heard this morning, comes the lost son, one of Jesus' best known and best loved parables. Traditionally it's called the prodigal son, and certainly the son was prodigal in the way he wasted his inheritance. But I think the truly prodigal, in other words, the extravagantly generous one in the story, is not the son, but the father. His younger son, had come to him and said in effect, "Father, I don't want to wait until you die before I receive my inheritance. I want it now." Not the most respectful thing to say to your father. But his father gave him the share of the property. And what does he do? He sells it. He then goes to a distant country and he throws away his money in an extravagant lifestyle. He then finds himself penniless and helpless in a time of famine. This man has in effect disowned his father and no doubt caused his father a great deal not only of grief but embarrassment in his community. People would have been saying about him he should have been strong and not let his son get away with it. This young man has disowned his nation, his faith, and his standards. In fact, he's gone so low that he's even willing to feed pigs in order to at least get some income. Feeding pigs, something no self-respecting Jew or law-abiding Jew would ever do. Even then, we're told, the pay was so low that the pigs were eating better than he was. And then he realises that back home, his father's servants are far better off than he is now. Could it be that his father will have him back, at least as a servant? He knows that he's caused huge offence to his father and his family. They may well refuse to have anything to do with him. Perhaps they'll make him squirm for all he's done. "Why are you coming back here? You've disowned your family, you've made a mess of your life, and now you want us to solve your problems. You've made your own bed, now lie in it." And to be realistic, no doubt this young man's motives in thinking of going back to his father were pretty mixed, just as ours often are. But back he goes. I guess he feels he can't do any worse. And as we heard in our reading, his father's not just waiting for him, his father actually runs out to warmly greet him, extremely warmly. This was a very demeaning thing for a respected man to do. You don't run anyway if you're a good, respected man of standing. And as for receiving his son like this, what a weakling he must be. Well, the son begins his words of sorrow and humility. But his father's much more concerned with the joy of having his son restored and back home. Get him good clothes, clothes that are befitting for a son of the family, and let's have a party. The son was far from worthy, but there was still a great celebration when he came back home. The son who was lost had been found. But of course there's a second half to this story, isn't there? It was the younger son who'd gone off and disowned his family, but the older son stayed home and worked hard as he always had. And what is his reaction when he's heard that his brother has returned home and that there's a big party to celebrate? He reacts in what we might feel is a pretty understandable way. That's not right. That's not fair. He doesn't deserve all this. And he gets into an argument with his father. "I've slaved for you all these years. I've never disobeyed you. And yet you've never given me anything so that I could have a party with my friends. You may call him your son, but I'm not going to think of him as my brother." Yes, it is quite understandable. But this son, the way he speaks, seems to think of himself as more like his father's slave than his father's son. His brother was lost and he is now found. But if those words reflect his relationship with his father, perhaps he's the one who is also lost in a different way. You could be within sight, but you can still be lost. We see of marriages where it's a bit like that, sadly, isn't it? We know the point of this story of Jesus. God welcomes sinners back. We are lost because we so often live our lives cut off from God because of our own self-centeredness. But God is always seeking those who are lost, and he welcomes them back into the family and to his household. And in some way we do need to recognise that there is a real lostness to all humans. All of us need to return to our loving Creator God. And of course it's not just a matter of pretending. We don't know the end of the story. We don't know how the older son reacted to his father, and we don't actually know whether the younger son proved to be a good son from now on. But if we're coming back to God, and we were thinking about this last week as well, coming back to God is not just a matter of making a dramatic decision. It's a matter of following through that decision as well. Coming back to be God's person means that we come now to live as God's people. That idea of repenting, turning away from our own agenda, and recognising not only God's gracious love for us, but also God's gracious, righteous claim on our lives. God generously, very generously through Christ, offers us forgiveness. He treats us as his forgiven and welcomed people, members of his eternal and beloved family. That forgiveness is a joyous and wonderful thing, spoken about in our psalm this morning as well. And this new relationship with God is effectively, as Paul describes it, a new creation, a new world we live in a sense. It's worth asking ourselves which of the two sons we are most like. Some of us may be able to look back at our spiritual stories and see that our lives were turned upside down as we came to understand the message of God's love and the gospel of Jesus Christ. There may be some of us who feel a bit like that younger son who were quite on the wrong path, but then found and were forgiven and welcomed into God's family. But I suspect many of us have more or less lived our lives as members of God's family. We don't claim to be perfect, but we've long been members of the church. We've tried to live reasonable, godly lives. We haven't done what others would see as really terrible things. In that sense, our position may be more like that of the elder son, and like those scribes and Pharisees who were so critical of Jesus. There is always the temptation for people like us to judge, to exclude. Many of us can remember the days when Protestant children were definitely not supposed to play with Catholic children, and vice versa. I don't remember ever being told to avoid Orthodox Christians, but I don't think as a boy I knew what Orthodox Christians, that they existed. And certainly I didn't know any Muslims, the people who are not like us. Now we live in days where politicians and leaders and influencers are so quick to put up barriers to seek to divide people. Days when we are at times when we are called to judge and reject people who are not like us, or who don't measure up to our expectations. Of course, we need to judge and assess people's attitudes and actions so that we can recognise and avoid those things which are wrong. But Jesus calls us to be open to people who might seem lost, people who may have made something of a mess of their lives. Perhaps even through us, some of these people might find encouragement and support that will help them open up to the grace of God and find the hope that is in Jesus. As Paul says in our reading, the message of reconciliation has been entrusted to us Christians. And so we are called to act and speak and relate and serve so that people have the opportunity to discover that God loves and is ready to forgive them, and that they may find their hope in the gospel of Christ. And as we seek to love our neighbour, let's remember that our neighbour could be anyone at all, someone like us, or someone very different, someone we might be drawn to, or someone we might be tempted to reject. Jesus calls us to be welcoming people rather than judgmental people. Our prodigal son, our over-the-top generous God, forgives us at incredible cost the death of his own beloved son. May we remain open to God's generous and welcoming love, and may we reflect that love and share that love in our lives. Amen.